Section 27 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 1, by Henry Gray. The Lachrymal Bone, Os Lacrymale. The lachrymal bone, the smallest and most fragile bone of the face, is situated at the front part of the medial wall of the orbit. It has two surfaces and four borders. Surfaces. The lateral or orbital surface is divided by a vertical ridge, the posterior lachrymal crest, into two parts. In front of this crest is a longitudinal groove, the lachrymal sulcus, sulcus lachrymalis, the inner margin of which unites with the frontal process of the maxilla, and the lachrymal fossa is thus completed. The upper part of this fossa lodges the lachrymal sac, the lower part the naso-lachrymal duct. The portion behind the crest is smooth, and forms part of the medial wall of the orbit. The crest, with a part of the orbital surface immediately behind it, gives origin to the lachrymal part of the orbicularis oculi, and ends below in a small hook-like projection, the lachrymal hamulus, which articulates with the lachrymal tubercle of the maxilla, and completes the upper orifice of the lachrymal canal. It sometimes exists as a separate piece, and is then called the lesser lachrymal bone. The medial or nasal surface presents a longitudinal furrow corresponding to the crest on the lateral surface. The area in front of this furrow forms part of the middle meatus of the nose; that behind it articulates with the ethmoid, and completes some of the anterior ethmoidal cells. Borders. Of the four borders, the anterior articulates with the frontal process of the maxilla, the posterior with the lamina papyracea of the ethmoid, the superior with the frontal bone. The inferior is divided by the lower edge of the posterior lachrymal crest into two parts. The posterior part articulates with the orbital plate of the maxilla. The anterior is prolonged downwards as the descending process, which articulates with the lachrymal process of the inferior nasal concha, and assists in forming the canal for the naso-lachrymal duct. Ossification. The lachrymal is ossified from a single centre, which appears about the 12th week in the membrane covering the cartilaginous nasal capsule. Articulations. The lachrymal articulates with four bones, two of the cranium, the frontal and ethmoid, and two of the face, the maxilla and the inferior nasal concha. The zygomatic bone, os zygomaticum, malar bone. The zygomatic bone is small and quadrangular, and is situated at the upper and lateral part of the face. It forms the prominence of the cheek, part of the lateral wall and floor of the orbit, and parts of the temporal and infratemporal fossae. It presents a malar and a temporal surface. Four processes, the frontosphenoidal, orbital, maxillary, and temporal, and four borders. Surfaces. The malar surface is convex and perforated near its centre by a small aperture, the zygomaticofacial foramen, for the passage of the zygomaticofacial nerve and vessels. Below this foramen is a slight elevation, which gives origin to the zygomaticus. The temporal surface, directed backward and medialward, is concave, presenting medially a rough triangular area for articulation with the maxilla, and laterally a smooth concave surface, the upper part of which forms the anterior boundary of the temporal fossa, the lower a part of the infratemporal fossa. Near the centre of this surface is the zygomaticotemporal foramen, for the transmission of the zygomaticotemporal nerve. Processes. The frontosphenoidal process is thick and serrated, and articulates with the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. On its orbital surface, just within the orbital margin and about 11 millimetres below the zygomatico-frontal suture, is a tubercle of varying size and form, but present in 95% of skulls. The orbital process is a thick strong plate, projecting backward and medialward from the orbital margin. Its anteromedial surface forms, by its junction with the orbital surface of the maxilla and with the great wing of the sphenoid, part of the floor and lateral wall of the orbit. On it are seen the orifices of two canals, the zygomatico-orbital foramina. One of these canals opens into the temporal fossa, the other on the malar surface of the bone. The former transmits the zygomatico-temporal, the latter the zygomatico-facial nerve. Its posterolateral surface, smooth and convex, forms part of the temporal and infratemporal fossae. Its anterior margin, smooth and rounded, is part of the circumference of the orbit. Its superior margin, rough and directed horizontally, articulates with the frontal bone behind the zygomatic process. Its posterior margin is serrated for articulation with the great wing of the sphenoid and the orbital surface of the maxilla. At the angle of junction of the sphenoidal and maxillary portions, a short, concave, non-articular part is generally seen. This forms the anterior boundary of the inferior orbital fissure. Occasionally this non-articular part is absent, the fissure then being completed by the junction of the maxilla and sphenoid, or by the interposition of a small sutural bone in the angular interval between them. The maxillary process presents a rough triangular surface which articulates with the maxilla. The temporal process, long, narrow, and serrated, articulates with the zygomatic process of the temporal. Borders. The antero-superior or orbital border is smooth, concave, and forms a considerable part of the circumference of the orbit. The antero-inferior or maxillary border is rough, and bevelled at the expense of its inner table, to articulate with the maxilla. Near the orbital margin it gives origin to the quadratus labii superioris. The postero-superior or temporal border, curved like an italic letter F, is continuous above with the commencement of the temporal line, and below with the upper border of the zygomatic arch. The temporal fascia is attached to it. The postero-inferior or zygomatic border affords attachment by its rough edge to the masseter. Ossification. The zygomatic bone is generally described as ossifying from three centres, one for the malar and two for the orbital portion. These appear about the 8th week, and fuse about the 5th month of foetal life. Mal describes it as being ossified from one centre which appears just beneath and to the lateral side of the orbit. After birth the bone is sometimes divided by a horizontal suture into an upper larger and a lower smaller division. In some quadrumana the zygomatic bone consists of two parts, an orbital and a malar. Articulations. The zygomatic articulates with four bones, the frontal, sphenoidal, temporal, and maxilla. End of section 27.